June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy were waking under a grey, heavy sky. The air smelled of salt, smoke and fear. German soldiers braced behind bunkers, waiting for tanks and artillery, the kind of war they understood. But what came instead was something else entirely. A single American machine gun, the M250 caliber, tore through steel, stone and confidence alike. Its deep roar echoed across the sand like thunder that never stopped. To the Germans it felt unfair. A weapon too powerful, too relentless, too American, and that fear would follow them all the way to Berlin. They called it the 50, but behind that name was a story few ever heard. A story of design genius, endless firepower, and the weapon that changed how every soldier thought about survival. So before we dive into how this one gun earned the hate and the respect of an entire army, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and watch till the end to uncover the untold truth behind the most feared machine gun of World War II. January 26, 1945. The French village of Holtzwihr lay frozen under grey clouds. Smoke rose from broken chimneys. The snow was black with ash and spent shells. On the edge of the forest, a single American soldier stood on top of a burning tank destroyer, his face smeared with blood and dirt, his breath steaming in the cold. His name was Lieutenant Audie Murphy. German infantry poured out of the trees yelling and firing. Behind them rolled tanks, their tracks crushing the ice. Most of Murphy's men had already fallen back. The field was quiet except for the rumble of engines and the crack of distant rifles. Then came the sound that every German in that valley would remember, the deep, thunderous hammering of the Browning M250 caliber machine gun. Murphy had climbed onto the disabled tank destroyer, aimed the mounted 50 and squeezed the trigger. The heavy gun spat fire and smoke. Each shot sounded like a metal door slamming shut. Bullets tore through snow, wood and armour. German soldiers who tried to crawl forward were thrown back by invisible punches. The smell of burning fuel mixed with hot oil and cordite. Witnesses later said the air shimmered with tracers. Murphy fired until his ammunition ran out, calling artillery strikes by radio as the gun glowed red hot. One man against a company, and yet, when the shooting stopped, the Germans were gone. Over 50 lay dead or wounded. It was more than bravery. It was the sound of America's most feared weapon in World War II. The Browning M2, a 50 caliber heavy machine gun, was first built in the 1930s. It weighed over 80 pounds, fired at nearly 600 rounds per minute, and could punch through armour from more than a mile away. The weapon was simple, steady, and built like a piece of factory steel. It could be mounted on tanks, planes, jeeps, and ships, anything that moved. German soldiers gave it many nicknames: the Dreadful 50, the Thunder Gun, the American Hammer. They wrote in letters that the heavy machine gun of the Americans is the devil's breath. What they feared most was not its technology, it was how often they faced it. Every US squad, every convoy, every airfield had one. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, American landing craft opened their ramps under fire. German defenders expected to crush the assault with MG-42s, fast and deadly weapons. But once the Americans set up their M2s on the beach, the sound of battle changed. The slow, booming rhythm of the 50s cut through the chaos. German gunners could no longer lift their heads. The beach that should have been impassable became a deadly exchange. Metal for metal, rhythm for rhythm. A German sergeant captured weeks later told his interrogators, "Your big machine gun, it breaks our nerves. It never stops. It kills the trees, the walls, and the men behind them." Unlike the German guns, which overheated and jammed under long bursts, the M2 kept firing. Its design was forgiving. Sand, mud, or snow made little difference. American mechanics could fix it in minutes using a single wrench. And because the US industry produced millions of rounds each week, soldiers never worried about wasting ammunition. That was the paradox of the Western Front. German troops were trained to fight with precision and economy, while the Americans fought with overwhelming volume. The M2 symbolized that difference. Each gun was not just a weapon, it was a factory output, a product of mass production turned into battlefield power. In one after-action report, a German commander wrote that his men felt hunted by fire that came from everywhere. He meant the M2, from tanks, trucks, and even aircraft above. It didn't matter where they moved. Somewhere, a heavy gun was waiting. The weapon changed more than tactics. It changed morale. German units began to avoid open ground even when they had the advantage. The sharp, repetitive thump of a 50 made them freeze, even if no bullets came near. It was the sound of hopelessness, the reminder that no amount of courage could outlast a weapon that never ran out of ammo. When the battle for Holtzwihr ended, the snow was littered with shell casings. Murphy's hands were blistered, his face pale from exhaustion. Later, when asked how he managed to hold off an entire attack, he simply said, "They were killing my friends, and I was killing them." His weapon had done the rest. But this was only the beginning. Across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, thousands of soldiers would soon learn what the Germans already knew, that the M2 was more than a machine gun. It was an idea forged in metal, a lesson in how simplicity, reliability, and sheer firepower could win a modern war. The smoke over Holtzwihr drifted eastward that night. In the frozen silence, one truth was clear. The Germans didn't hate the M2 because it was cruel. They hated it because it worked every time. For German medics, the war was filled with sounds, the whistle of mortars, the crack of rifles, the scream of the wounded. But there was one sound that made them freeze, the deep, rolling beat of the American 50 caliber machine gun. They knew what came next. Moments after that thunder, the stretchers would start coming in, carrying men torn apart in ways no one had seen before. The Browning M2 did not wound like other weapons. Its bullet was half an inch wide, moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It didn't just pierce flesh, it shattered bone, tore through metal helmets, and left wounds impossible to treat in the field. A German doctor near Aachen wrote in his diary, "The big American bullet removes what it touches. A man hit in the arm loses the arm. A man hit in the chest is already gone." At the front, the smell of burned cloth and hot metal mixed with the sting of disinfectant. In makeshift medical tents, the floors were sticky with blood and mud. Field nurses cut away uniforms and tried to stop bleeding that would not stop. The 50 caliber round created exit wounds the size of fists, often throwing men off their feet. Even when the bullet didn't hit directly, the shockwave could break ribs or rupture organs. American medics saw it too, not just on the enemy, but on their own soldiers who were caught in friendly fire or air attacks. They learned quickly that the 50 was not just a gun. It was a storm of destruction. A bullet that powerful could go through 2 men and keep travelling. In cities like Cologne and Caen, even thick stone walls couldn't stop it. To the Germans, this was terrifying. Their MG42 fired faster, 200 rounds per minute, but its smaller bullet lacked the same raw force. The M2 fired slower, but every hit counted. It could punch through armoured cars, machine gun nests, even the steel plates of half-tracks. One bullet could turn cover into a death trap. A German soldier named Heinrich Vogel wrote home after surviving an American ambush in Normandy, "Our helmets are useless. The big gun cuts through everything. We hide behind the walls, but the walls fall." His letter was later found among captured papers. It was short, shaky, and written in pencil stained with blood. Medical officers began to recognize a pattern. Wherever the 50 appeared, morale dropped. The wounded arrived not only broken but silent. Many refused morphine, some refused to speak at all. They looked pale, shaking, staring into nothing. The doctors called it Schockzustand, shock state. Numbers told the same story. By late 1944, US factories were producing over 4 million 50 caliber rounds every day. Every bomber carried thousands. Every armoured division used millions each month. The result was simple. The weapon was everywhere, and it changed the rhythm of the battlefield. The impact went beyond the physical. The 50's deep sound carried across valleys and through city ruins. Soldiers described it as a heartbeat, steady, relentless, inhuman. It felt like the ground itself was shooting at us, one German corporal told Allied interrogators after surrendering near Bastogne. For medics, that sound meant another wave of wounded. They learned to count the beats to guess how many men were hit. Sometimes they could tell by sound alone. A short burst meant one or two, a long burst meant many. As winter came, the cold froze everything except fear. In Ardennes villages, German doctors worked with numb fingers and dwindling supplies. They used melted snow to clean wounds and wrapped men in old blankets. But even in those frozen conditions, the 50 bullets caused infections faster. Metal fragments carried bits of cloth and dirt deep inside, making surgery impossible without proper tools. In one field hospital outside Malmedy, a nurse recalled, "The men from the front came in burned, torn and quiet. When they said it was the big gun, we knew it would be bad. We could save few." By 1945, the weapon had changed the way both sides thought about cover and movement. No trench felt deep enough. No stone wall felt thick enough. Soldiers learned to fear open ground, to move only when the thunder stopped. The German command issued orders warning units to avoid unnecessary exposure to American heavy machine guns. But avoiding them was nearly impossible. On every front, in every corner of Europe, the M2 was waiting, on a jeep, on a tank, on a rooftop, or in the sky above. The war was still far from over, yet for thousands of men that gun had already written its lesson. Precision and bravery meant little when faced with endless, unstoppable fire. The Germans had built fast, clever weapons. The Americans had built one that never failed. And in the war of endurance, that difference was fatal. The doctors could stitch wounds, clean burns, and give morphine, but they could not stop the fear. Every time the deep echo rolled across the battlefield, they knew more stretchers would soon arrive. And as the war went on, the thunder didn't fade, it only grew louder. September 6th, 1943. Over Germany, the air was thin and freezing. Hundreds of American bombers droned through the clouds, their silver bodies shining in the morning sun. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 5 on the sides, 2 in the nose, 2 in the tail, and the rest in turrets. It was a fortress not just in name, but in firepower. Below them waited German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Fokker-Wulf 190s. Their pilots were experienced, confident, and fast. They had fought in Russia, in Africa, and over France. They knew how to kill bombers, but this time, something was different. As the first wave of fighters climbed toward the American formation, the air suddenly filled with fire. Streams of orange tracers poured out from every direction. Each gun spat out heavy 50 caliber rounds at nearly 600 per minute. With more than 400 bombers in the air, that meant almost 500,000 bullets flying every 60 seconds. German pilots described it as flying into a wall of light. One of them, Oberleutnant Hans Götze, later said, "You didn't see planes. You saw a cloud of fire that ate your squadron." Some aircraft were torn apart before they could even fire a shot. Others pulled away, their engines smoking, their wings shredded. The smell inside a B-17 was a mix of sweat, oil, and gunpowder. The air gunners wore thick gloves to keep from burning their hands on the barrels. Shell casings rolled across the floor like brass rain. Each man fired in short bursts, trying not to overheat his weapon, though in the chaos it was easy to lose control. The noise was deafening, a constant thunder of overlapping 50s that shook the fuselage. For every bomber that fell, 3 or 4 German fighters went down. The M2s didn't just protect, they punished. In one mission alone, over Stuttgart, American gunners claimed more than 50 enemy aircraft destroyed. Whether every claim was accurate or not, the effect was clear. the Luftwaffe began to fear daylight raids. A gunner named Jack Reynolds recalled, "You couldn't see the men in those fighters, just flashes, but you could feel the hits when they got close. Then the 50s roared back, and suddenly they were gone." The M2 wasn't just effective in defense, it gave pilots new confidence. The P-47 Thunderbolt, armed with 8 of these guns, became a flying chainsaw. Each burst could rip through trains, trucks, and even small ships. Pilots would dive low over enemy lines, their guns blazing, leaving rows of burning vehicles behind them. The Germans called these strafing runs Höllenregen, hell rain. In one report from 1944, a German armoured officer wrote, "We could not move in daylight. The Thunderbolts come like hawks. Their big guns tear our columns apart. Even the tanks feel their bite." Those guns were the same M2s, reliable, rugged, and everywhere. Whether on a bomber, a fighter, or a jeep on the ground, they never changed. The paradox was clear. German engineers had designed faster planes and more powerful cannons, 20 and 30-metre shells that could destroy a bomber with a single hit. But they couldn't match the sheer number of American guns. The US didn't win by designing the most advanced weapon. It won by putting enough of a good one everywhere it mattered. By late 1944, the sky itself had become part of that machine. Every convoy, every field, every train yard behind the front lines could be attacked at any time. The roar of aircraft and the hammering of 50 caliber fire became the daily soundtrack of war. Even on the ground, German soldiers looked up when they heard that sound. The low growl of engines meant death could strike from above. Not from bombs, but from those lines of fire that seemed to never miss. A captured Luftwaffe mechanic told his interrogators, "We could build new planes, but not new men. The gunners never missed, and the new boys were afraid to fly." That was the unseen victory of the Browning 50. It broke not just machines, but morale. In the winter of 1944, American bombers flew deeper into German airspace than ever before. Their gunners sang songs through the intercom, half to calm themselves, half to cover the noise. They trusted their guns more than luck. One pilot wrote in his journal after a mission over Berlin, "The guns are our armour. Without them, we are just targets in the sky." By war's end, US planes had fired more than 1 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Cities, railways, and airfields across Europe bore the marks of those bullets. What began as a weapon to protect soldiers on the ground had become the guardian of the sky, a weapon that turned airspace into a fortress and courage into survival. But while the skies belonged to the Browning, the ground war still raged below, and the same gun that ruled the air was now mounted on every truck, tank, and jeep that rolled toward Germany. The fire from above was about to meet the thunder from below. Winter, 1944, Belgium. The roads were covered with snow, the trees heavy with ice. American convoys crawled through the frozen countryside, their engines coughing in the cold. Every jeep, half-track and truck had one thing in common: a Browning M2 50 caliber mounted on top, its barrel wrapped in canvas to keep out the frost. To the soldiers, that gun was more than a weapon. It was a shield. The M2 was everywhere, on tanks, on supply trucks, even on boats crossing rivers. It fired 700 rounds per minute and could hit targets more than a mile away. Its bullets could punch through concrete, light armour, or even walls that soldiers thought would protect them. German troops quickly learned to fear the sound. The deep thudding of the 50 cal echoed through the forests long before the Americans appeared. "You could hear it before you saw it," said German infantryman Erich Dossler. "When it spoke, you stayed down. You didn't move. It was not like our machine guns. It was heavier, like the sky was breaking." The Browning wasn't just used for fighting enemy soldiers. It protected the endless lifeline of the war. The convoys. Thousands of trucks carried food, ammunition, and fuel across Europe. Without them, the front would die. But every mile of road was dangerous. German ambush teams waited with Panzerfausts and MG-42s, ready to strike. So the Americans adapted. Before sending trucks through risky areas, they used what they called recon by fire. Jeeps fitted with M2s would drive ahead and fire bursts into tree lines, bridges, or suspicious houses. If someone shot back, the convoy would stop and artillery or air support would handle the rest. It was a brutal method, but it worked. Many ambushes never happened because no one dared to move after hearing that 50 open up. In one report from the Ardennes, an American sergeant wrote, "We didn't wait to be attacked. We made sure the other guy thought twice first." The M2 was also mounted on the famous M16 half-track, a vehicle with 4 50 caliber guns in a rotating turret, nicknamed the Meat Chopper. It was designed for shooting down planes, but soldiers found it just as deadly against ground targets. In battles across France and Belgium, these vehicles tore through enemy infantry, cutting down entire squads before they could react. A captured German officer said, "When the half-tracks came, we could do nothing. The fire was too fast, too heavy. You could not even raise your head." Even tanks carried the M2. Commanders often stood half exposed in the turret, their hands frozen to the grips, firing at any target that moved. The heavy gun tore through buildings, knocked out enemy trucks, and even forced surrender from soldiers hiding in trenches. The sound of a 50 cal on the move became a symbol of American advance. It was steady, confident, relentless, each burst announcing that the US Army was coming and nothing could stop it. But there was a cost. The gun was heavy, over 80 pounds with its mount, and needed strong soldiers to handle it. Its recoil could shake a jeep or push a truck slightly backward if fired too long. Gunners' ears rang for hours after each firefight. The barrels often overheated, glowing red in the dark. Yet no one complained. Private Harold Tate once said, "That gun saved us more times than I can count. You clean it, feed it, and it keeps you alive." The Germans tried to match the power of the M2 with their own 30mm MG 131 and 20mm autocannons, but they couldn't mount them everywhere like the Americans did. The US had the factories, the steel, and the fuel to put a Browning on almost everything that moved. That was the real secret. Not just technology, but supply. By late 1944, American units had produced more than 2 million M2s. That's enough to give every squad, every truck, and every tank its own wall of fire. The weapon became part of US military identity, simple, strong, and always ready. The Germans called it Die schreckliche 50, the terrible 50. Some believed it could tear a man in half or rip through an armoured car. Many stories grew around it, and even if some were exaggerated, the fear was real. As the Allied forces moved east toward the Rhine, the M2 became their constant companion. On bridges, it guarded engineers. On trucks, it watched over supplies. On tanks, it gave commanders their voice of power. The weapon had started as a defensive gun, but now it was a tool of domination, an iron guardian that led every advance and crushed every counterattack. When the snow finally began to melt, the roads turned to mud. The engines sputtered, the men were tired, but the guns still roared. And with every burst of the Browning, Germany's defences grew weaker. The M2 was no longer just protecting the convoys, it was leading them, straight into the heart of the Reich. When American engineers designed the Browning M2, they were not trying to build a symbol, they were building a tool that simply had to work no matter where it went. It was first developed by John Moses Browning back in the 1910s, just after World War I, when armies realised they needed something stronger than the rifle-caliber machine guns that had filled the trenches. The idea was simple: make a weapon that could stop planes, punch through armour, and keep firing in the worst conditions. What came out of that dream was a heavy steel gun firing half-inch bullets, each round weighing nearly 50 grams and leaving the barrel at almost 900 metres per second. That's fast enough to tear through light tanks, airplanes, and concrete walls. The M2 was 65 inches long and weighed about 84 pounds without its mount. A full setup with a tripod or vehicle mount could go over 120 pounds. It was not something a man could easily carry into battle, but once in place, it could dominate an entire field. Its range was enormous. It could hit a man-sized target at 1/800 meters and even reach out to 6,000 meters for suppression fire. When American troops wanted to stop enemy movement, they simply mounted the M2 and opened fire. What made it special was not just its power, but its reliability. The M2 worked in snow, sand, rain, and mud. Soldiers said it could fire even when covered in dust, frozen by winter, or drenched in oil. As long as it was cleaned and fed good ammunition, it almost never failed. Private James Leland from the 2nd Armoured Division wrote home, "We trust that gun more than anything. It never jams when things get bad. If it does, it's because the man didn't take care of it, not because it quit on him." The gun fired several types of bullets, armour-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. The combination of these made it deadly against everything from aircraft to bunkers. In the air, pilots used belts of tracer rounds to guide their aim. On the ground, infantry used armour-piercing rounds to destroy vehicles. By 1942, American factories had perfected the process of making M2s at massive scale. Plants in New York, Ohio, and Michigan worked day and night. At the peak of production, the US was building over 80,000 M2 machine guns per month. Ammunition plants made millions of rounds every day. This wasn't just industry, it was power in motion. While Germany struggled to replace tanks and planes lost in battle, America kept sending more guns, more trucks, more ammo. The enemy could destroy a weapon, but not the machine that built it. Each part of the M2 was made with exact precision. A single bolt could fit any other M2 built anywhere in the country. That meant broken guns could be fixed quickly in the field. Mechanics didn't need custom tools. They could swap out parts like puzzle pieces. That kind of standardization was revolutionary at the time. It turned war into a production race, and no one could match America's speed. The paradox was clear. Germany had advanced designs and powerful tanks, but they could not produce enough. America, on the other hand, built simpler machines, but built them by the millions. The M2 became the symbol of that difference. A German report captured in 1944 read, "The Americans do not fear to waste bullets. Their guns never stop. Our men believe each truck they face has a cannon on top." Even the design itself inspired respect. The M2 could be fired single shot or fully automatic. It could be mounted on a tank, ship, plane, or simply placed on a hill. The same gun that a bomber used in the sky could be found on a tank in the mud. No redesign was needed. It was flexible, tough, and timeless. John Browning, who had died before the war began, could never see how far his invention would go. But his creation shaped every battlefield in World War II, from the beaches of Normandy to the deserts of Africa and the islands of the Pacific. By the end of the war, the US had produced over 2.7 million M2s and more than 3 billion rounds of ammunition. Each one of those guns carried the same promise. It would work, and it would protect. Even decades later, the M2 barely changed. Modern versions still look and sound the same. Soldiers in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan used the same weapon that their grandfathers carried across Europe. There's a reason they still call it Madus, the mother of all guns. It wasn't beautiful, and it wasn't light. But it was honest. It did exactly what it was made to do, and it kept doing it long after the war that made it famous had ended. And as America's war machine pushed deeper into Germany, the M2 was about to evolve again, from a defensive tool to an unstoppable force of attack. Spring 1945. The roads of Western Germany were filled with noise, the grind of tank treads, the hum of engines, and the steady, angry bark of Browning .50 calibers. The war was entering its final months, but the fighting was as fierce as ever. Everywhere the Americans moved, the M2 moved with them. It was now part of every kind of machine, from the half-track on the ground to the fighter above the clouds. The most feared of these ground machines was the M16 half-track. It carried 4 Browning .50 cals on a rotating turret. Soldiers called it the meat chopper. When its guns opened fire, the air filled with thunder and smoke. Each second, it could send almost 2,800 bullets toward the target. Originally made to shoot down aircraft, the M16 quickly found a new job, tearing apart enemy infantry and vehicles. A German soldier who survived an ambush in the Ruhr Valley said, "It was like facing 4 storms at once. You could not hide. Trees, walls, trucks. Everything was cut down." The power of those 4 guns made the M16 perfect for guarding convoys and clearing ambushes. It could sweep both sides of a road in seconds, leaving nothing standing. The flash of its tracers at night looked like fiery ropes stretching across the darkness. Soldiers said it was like watching lightning under human control. While the M16 dominated the ground, the skies belonged to the P-47 Thunderbolt, one of the heaviest and toughest fighters of the war. It carried 8 Browning M2s, 4 in each wing. Each burst from a P-47 lasted only a few seconds, but it could destroy a truck column or slice open a locomotive like a tin can. American pilots used the 50s to hunt German armour from above. They would dive fast, fire short bursts and pull away before enemy flak could respond. In the air, the gun's rhythm sounded like a hammering drum beat, deep, fast, and final. Captain Bill Dunham, a US pilot, once said, "You didn't aim at one tank. You aimed at a line of them. The guns did the rest." Each 50 cal round had enough power to pierce the top armour of most light and medium vehicles. When combined with the sheer speed of the Thunderbolt's dive, it became almost unstoppable. Even heavier machines like the M10 tank destroyer carried the M2. On top of its turret, the gun gave the crew a way to fight infantry or aircraft when the main cannon wasn't enough. Tank commanders often stood half out of the hatch, gripping the cold steel handles of the Browning, sweeping it across rooftops or tree lines. In the narrow streets of German towns where danger could come from any window, the M2 became their lifeline. Its heavy rounds could punch through walls and shatter snipers' positions without risking a close fight. The combination of these platforms, the M16 on the roads, the P-47 in the skies, and the M10 on the front lines, turned the M2 into a complete weapon system. It was everywhere, always ready, always feared. German morale began to break under the constant pressure. Their troops no longer controlled when to fight. The sound of approaching aircraft or the rumble of a half-track made them scatter or dig in. One Wehrmacht report from March 1945 admitted, "Enemy fire from large-caliber machine guns dominates every battlefield. Our infantry cannot move in daylight." The irony was striking. The Germans had once been the masters of movement warfare. Fast, coordinated, unstoppable. Now they were pinned down by the very kind of mobile firepower they had invented years earlier. The Americans had taken the concept of mobility and supercharged it with industry. They didn't rely on a few elite weapons. They flooded the field with reliable ones, and the M2 was at the heart of it all. Each time an M16 opened fire or a P-47 made a strafing run, it reminded the enemy that resistance was useless. The 50 wasn't just a bullet. It was a message. The United States had mastered the balance of power and production. When the final battles reached the outskirts of Berlin, the M2 had already proven itself in every role. Anti-aircraft, anti-vehicle, anti-personnel. Soldiers trusted it completely. They called it the American heartbeat, because its rhythm followed them from Normandy's beaches to the heart of Germany. Private Roy Campbell from the 9th Infantry wrote, "When that gun started talking, everyone listened, friend and foe. It meant we were safe, at least for a little while." The M2 had become more than a machine gun. It was a moving wall of fire that followed every American advance. And yet, even as it tore through the last defences of the Reich, its role was about to change once again. Because when the battles quieted and night fell, the Browning's tracers lit up a new kind of war, one fought not just with steel, but with fear. Night fell over the ruined towns of Germany like a heavy curtain. The roads glowed faintly with moonlight, and the only sounds were the cold wind and the low rumble of distant trucks. But when the Browning M2s opened fire, the darkness vanished. Red and orange tracers cut through the black sky in long glowing lines. For a few seconds it looked like the horizon itself was burning. To soldiers on the ground, those tracers were more than bullets. They were light, hope, and fear all at once. Each fifth round was a tracer, glowing so the gunners could see where their bullets went. It made the battlefield come alive with streaks of fire that seemed to dance through the air. For American troops, the tracers gave control in chaos. They could guide their aim, adjust quickly, and stay confident even in total darkness. But for German troops, those same glowing lines were pure terror. Every red streak meant death was coming. You couldn't see the shooter, only the fire racing toward you. One German private wrote in his diary, "The night belonged to them. Their guns glowed like dragons, and we hid in holes like rats." The M2's deep, thunderous rhythm became a sound no German soldier could forget. It was slower than their MG-42, but heavier, more final, each shot like a hammer falling on steel, and it didn't stop when the sun went down. American convoys guarded by their mounted M2s kept moving through the night. Any flicker of movement on the roadside was met with a short burst of glowing bullets. The soldiers called it painting the night. To anyone watching from afar, it looked like rivers of fire flowing through the dark hills. It was both beautiful and terrifying, beauty built from destruction. Those tracers also changed morale on both sides. For Americans, the constant glow of their guns gave a strange comfort. It reminded them they were not alone. "When you saw the red lines flying beside you," said Sergeant Leo Parker, "you knew another squad was still out there fighting with you." For the Germans, it had the opposite effect. The endless firing made them feel trapped, hunted. Even when no Americans were nearby, they imagined that red light appearing at any second. Fear spread faster than bullets. By 1945, many German soldiers no longer fought at night unless they had to. Reports from Wehrmacht officers described how enemy night fire creates panic among our troops. Some units refused to move in the dark at all, waiting for daylight even if it meant being spotted by planes. That was one of the M2's hidden victories. It didn't just destroy enemies, it broke their will to fight. Each tracer round burned magnesium and phosphorus to make it visible. The smell of it, sharp, metallic and chemical, filled the air after every burst. For the gunners, it clung to their gloves and uniforms. For the men downrange, it meant death could come at any second. At night, the battlefield was no longer about seeing the enemy. It was about hearing and feeling, the low hum of the barrel cooling, the faint ringing in the ears after each burst, the heartbeat racing as you waited for the next flash. And still, the M2 never failed. It fired through rain, snow and fog, tracing arcs of red light over forests and villages. It was as if the gun itself never slept. Even civilians came to recognize its sound. In bombed-out towns, people hiding in basements would whisper, "The Americans are near," when they heard the heavy rhythmic roar of the Browning echoing down the streets. It became a strange kind of promise, destruction for some, safety for others. One US gunner said after the war, "When you pulled that trigger, you weren't just firing bullets, you were firing fear." The tracers also helped command coordination. Officers could signal attacks or movements using patterns of tracer fire. Red for suppression, white for marking targets, green for safe paths. It turned light itself into a language of war. But as the Americans advanced deeper into Germany, something else became clear. The weapon that ruled the night wasn't just winning battles, it was rewriting how soldiers thought about combat. No longer did they need to wait for daylight or artillery. A single machine gun, armed with glowing rounds, could control a whole sector after dark. By the end of the war, many German survivors described the night sky not as black but red, streaked with the fire of 50 caliber tracers from jeeps, tanks and planes. The Browning had turned darkness into another weapon, and when the last battles quieted, the burned fields and bullet-marked walls stood as silent witnesses to its power. The M2 had conquered both the day and the night, but its legacy didn't end with victory. The same weapon that filled the skies with fire would soon come to define America's military future, not just as a tool of war, but as a symbol of what made its army unstoppable. May 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Smoke drifted over broken cities, and the sound of guns faded into silence. But one weapon, the Browning M2 50 caliber, had left its mark on every battlefield, every sky, and every soldier who heard it. It was more than a machine gun now. It was the symbol of American power, industry, and persistence. When the war began, the US Army didn't have the biggest guns or the fastest tanks. What it had was a clear idea: build reliable weapons that every soldier could use, build them fast, and build them in millions. That simple doctrine, supported by endless factories and steady workers, became the backbone of victory. The M2 was the perfect example of this idea. It wasn't a rare, high-tech weapon for elite troops. It was standard. The same gun that guarded a bomber over Berlin was mounted on a jeep in France or a tank in Italy. This unity gave American forces unmatched flexibility. Every unit, no matter where it fought, shared the same rhythm of fire. Factories across the United States worked day and night to meet demand. Men and women on assembly lines in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago became part of the front line. Each time they tightened a bolt or checked a barrel, they were giving a soldier somewhere in the world a fighting chance. A letter from a worker in Buffalo read, "We may not hold rifles, but every gun we build keeps our boys alive." That spirit of teamwork, from factory to front line, gave the Browning its true strength. Meanwhile, Germany was collapsing under its own weight. Its factories were bombed, its fuel was gone, and its armies couldn't keep up with constant losses. German engineers created amazing weapons: rockets, jet planes, heavy tanks, but they built them in small numbers. America didn't chase perfection, it chased production, and that made all the difference. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the US had shipped millions of M2s to Europe and the Pacific. There were so many that spare guns were used to reinforce bridges, mount on trains, or even defend camps far behind the front. The M2 had become a permanent part of the American war machine. Even enemy officers noticed it. After the war, one German general admitted, "We feared their machines less than their factories. They could lose 100 guns and replace them in a day." This was the paradox of the M2. It was not the newest or most advanced weapon. It was simply everywhere, unstoppable, because of how well and how many were built. The gun proved that industrial power could shape the outcome of war as much as strategy or courage. When peace finally came, the M2 didn't retire. It moved from one generation of soldiers to the next. It served in Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. 75 years later, it still stands on watch. The same design, the same power, the same voice. Mechanics have changed the mounts and optics, but the heart of the weapon remains pure Browning steel. The same slow, deep roar echoes across deserts and mountains today, just as it did across the fields of Europe in 1945. Military historians call it one of the most successful weapons ever built. It outlived the planes, tanks, and uniforms that first carried it, and for soldiers, it became more than a tool. It became a promise. When the M2 was nearby, they felt safe. Sergeant Tom Lewis once said in a post-war interview, "The Browning wasn't just a gun, it was a friend that never failed." The M2 also taught armies a lasting lesson. Wars are not won by having the biggest weapon, but by having the right one in the right hands. As the Cold War began, nations studied America's wartime model, the mix of mass production, teamwork, and practical design. The M2 became a blueprint for how to build weapons that last, that adapt, and that never stop working. Its story is still a paradox. It began as a simple invention meant to defend soldiers, but ended up defining the way nations fight. It destroyed, but it also protected. It was both a weapon of death and a symbol of endurance. By the time peace returned to Europe, The people who once feared it had learned to respect it. The Germans who called it the Terrible 50 now studied its design in their new factories. The same engineers who once cursed its fire would later help build NATO weapons modelled after it. They had come as conquerors, they left as students. In the end, the Browning M250 caliber wasn't just a tool of war, it was a mirror of America itself, strong, simple, reliable, and built to last. And though decades have passed, the echo of its fire still speaks the same truth, that the greatest weapon is not power alone, but the will and the hands that never stop building.